Hello, and now it's time for video number 2 in Module 1. So last time we talked about smallpox, we talked about urbanization, we talked about a million things. This video is going to be more about politics, right? So the way that people interact with their government and the way that they understand themselves as like citizens or participants in that government is going to change because of the Industrial Revolution, right? So the way that people sort of imagine their participation in society changes. And that freaks people out, right? Because this is coming on the heels of the American Revolution and the French Revolution, really the French Revolution, where the French were like, we don't like how you're treating us, so we're going to cut off your head, right? And so you have all of these people moving to cities and living in these kind of terrible conditions, and they don't have any workplace protections, and they are fighting to sort of help themselves get better lives, right? And so political philosophy has to respond to all of these changes. So they're going to be sort of, I put 5 isms. There's a 6th that we will briefly talk about, but like it doesn't matter as much, right? So we need to talk about liberalism, socialism, communism, anarchism, and then also nationalism. So nationalism fits a little oddly into this mixture, and we'll talk about why that is later. But that's what we need to do today. So we begin. Well, I said we begin. There we go. We begin with this lovely looking fellow, right? So conservatism in the 19th century is very popular amongst powerful people. But it's not going to play as big of a role in sort of people's lives as the other isms, so we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about it. And also the rest of these political ideologies still kind of resonate today, right? But conservatism in the 19th century, like classical conservatism, if that's what you want to call it, like it doesn't really exist anymore, right? So 19th century conservatism basically says we should be a monarchy. Monarchies are great. Kings are appointed by God, and therefore kings should have power. Those who have like lots of land and lots of money, God made them that way, therefore they should get to have all of the power, right? So conservatism in the 19th century is going to say that inherited systems of authority are better because those people are inherently better, right? So if you are poor, if you're a peasant, if you're part of the working class, if you're the rabble, right, you shouldn't be allowed to have access to power. 19th century conservatism is going to basically say that change is bad, that the government that we had in the 1700s is exactly what we need today in the 1800s, even though we've had an industrial revolution, even though we've had the French Revolution, even though we've had the American Revolution. Right, so you can see why conservatism in the 19th century doesn't have a whole lot of sort of cachet in the 20th, right? Like probably you don't know anybody who's a monarchist, I'm assuming, right? And so I've given you this picture. This is the picture of one of the last Habsburg monarchs, right? Who is inbred to a degree that I cannot really adequately describe to you. That's why his chin looks like that, right? Conservatives are going to look at that in the 19th century and be like, that dude is the dude. That dude should be in charge of everything. And everybody else is kind of looking at him like, no, not that dude. We don't want that dude, right? So conservatism is kind of off on the side, doing its own weird, different thing in the 19th century, right? More sort of impactful in terms of how politics is really going to work in the 19th century is going to be liberalism. Liberalism, or classical liberalism, is going to be probably the most important of the isms that we discuss, right? Now, I want to be super clear here. Like, I'm not really talking about, like, the modern day, like, Republican Party and Democratic Party. Like, that's not what's happening here. This is all happening in the 19th century, right? Like, modern political parties don't really exist yet, or if they do exist, they're like little baby parties. They don't really understand things yet, right? Like, this is not about today. This is about the 19th century, right? So liberalism in the 19th century is going to be one of the most popular political responses to the Industrial Revolution and to the call for change that the Industrial Revolution brings about, right? So the The granddaddy, the Mac Daddy, the whatever you want to call him, of liberalism is this guy, John Stuart Mill, right? And John Stuart Mill is going to sort of delineate a lot of the arguments and a lot of the positions that liberals are going to hold in the 19th century, right? And you can see it in your PowerPoint slide here. Liberalism is going to argue for slow, moderate reforms. Liberalism is going to say the people who don't have access to any power probably deserve some power, right? Like if you are a working class, if you're a peasant, you need some sort of access to power, right? Liberalism is going to say we have to change a little bit, otherwise the French Revolution is going to happen, right? If we don't kind of bend a little, if we don't change a little, then they're going to cut off all of our heads. So how can we make that not happen, right? And so liberalism is going to say, if we change a little bit, if we do this very slow, very moderate change, then hopefully, right, we can create a better society for everybody and also not get anybody's head cut off in the guillotine, right? So liberalism, and one of the sort of the questions that political philosophies in the 19th century have to talk about a lot is like, what's the role of the individual versus what is the role of the community, right? Like you have these two kind of like poles around which society is built. You have the individual person and you have the community in which that person lives, right? Mill and liberals in general are going to argue that the individual and the individual's rights are more important than communal rights, right? Now, that doesn't mean that the individual can just do whatever they want to do and the community doesn't matter at all, right? Liberalism is going to say there's a place for both of these things, the individual and the community in which that individual lives, right? Mill specifically is going to argue that an individual cannot harm another individual, right? That is breaking the rules of liberalism. You can't do that. Society needs to stop that from happening, right? So liberalism is not going to be out here being like, do whatever, murder, cool. Like liberalism is going to say, no, there are rules. You still live in a society, but you as a person, right? And specifically in the 19th century, you as a man deserve certain rights and liberties, right? So for Mill in particular, he sees society as sort of needing to have two kinds of liberty, right? Liberals are really interested in liberty from the government, right? The government infringing upon their rights. But Mill is like, you know what is equally important to that? Personal liberty, right? The right to do what you want to do with your body, with your feelings, with whatever, right? So Mill is going to argue that men need liberty from the government. The government should not be infringing upon their ability to live their lives. But he's also going to say that society can create a sort of peer pressure, right? Society can try to force you to do things that you don't want to do, and that is equally harmful to you, right? So he's like, you need to live life the way you want to live it, and society shouldn't be able to tell you what to do, and the government shouldn't be able to tell you what to do within sort of the constraints of you still live in a society and you have to exist in that society, right? I hope that makes sense to everybody. Now, liberals and pretty much all political philosophies in the 19th century, conservative, liberalism, communism, whatever, not particularly interested in women, right? This is a whole bunch of dudes arguing about what rights they should get to have. And the assumption is that women aren't human in the same way that men are. They don't have the same abilities to reason that men do. Therefore, they don't get to have any rights, right? John Stuart Mill is unusual in that he says that women have the capacity to be reasonable and rational in the same way that men do. And that women should have equal rights to men. Women should be allowed to vote. Right? And all of his liberal friends are like, what the heck, dude? How dare you suggest that these stupid ladies get to vote? But Mill has a very specific experience that leads him to believe in this idea of sort of political equality amongst the genders, right? Namely, and this will explain a lot about like Mill's overall philosophy, I think, when I tell you this story. So Mill is hanging out with all the cool, like, intelligentsia of London, the writers, the thinkers, right? And he meets this woman named Harriet Taylor. And he and Harriet Taylor kind of immediately fall in love. It is romantic love, but it's also a love of philosophy, political philosophy, right? They read together, they write together, they have lots of really interesting ideas that they cook up between the two of them. The problem is that Harriet Taylor is already married. So when she was a teenager, she married a guy named John Taylor. I'm sorry, everyone in the story is named John. She married a guy named John Taylor when he was in his mid-30s. And in 19th century British society, you can't really get a divorce, right? So the only way that Harriet Taylor would be able to obtain a divorce from her husband is if he was cheating on her in ways that were socially unacceptable. So, like, he can cheat on her. He can't, like, bring his mistress around for family dinner, right? Like, if she can prove that he's been, like, extra bad at cheating on her, then maybe she could get a divorce. She could get a divorce if she could prove that he was beating her more than was socially acceptable. So, like, the idea is that when a woman is married, she becomes the property of her husband, and her husband can deal with that property however he sees fit. But there are social limitations to, like, how much damage a husband could do to a wife, right? So, like, if you slap her, that's fine. That's your right as a husband. If you break her arm, it's getting a little dicey, right? If you are beating her up, like, on a very consistent basis in ways that are, like, very noticeable amongst the public, that's when you start to run into problems, right? So Harriet Taylor can't get a divorce from her husband unless he is doing one of those two things. And he's not, which, yay! But also, like, it means that Harriet is kind of trapped in this marriage, even though she and John Stuart Mill love each other. And so she and John Stuart Mill become writing partners. They become best friends, but they can't really be together, right? Until Harriet Taylor's husband dies. And when Harriet Taylor's husband dies, she and John Stuart Mill run away to France and get married. They can't come back to London. They can't live in London because their story is so scandalous to the rest of society, because everybody knew that they were in love before the husband died. And so you can see why John Stuart Mill might be interested in this idea of, like, society shouldn't get to tell me what to do. I want to do what makes me happy. Right? And so he is going to say, like, look, Harriet Taylor is a genius. She's so smart. We are intellectual equals. Why should she not also get to have a say in society and in politics? And everybody else in their sort of liberal circles in which they run are like, ooh, gross, no thank you, no ladies. Right? So that's liberalism, right? Now we come to our next ism. Socialism, right? Socialism is going to be more radical than liberalism, right? Not all socialists are going to advocate for revolution or violent revolution, right? But socialists in particular, so conservatism is going to be about the upper class. It's going to be about the kings. It's going to be about the dukes and the earls, right? Liberalism is really going to be about the middle class. It's going to be about white collar workers, those who have some wealth, right? Even though they're not the wealthiest, right? Socialism is going to be more about the working class, right? And you can see that in this pyramid of capitalist system, right? Socialists are going to be more invested in this bottom rung of the people who work for you and feed you, right? As opposed to the kind of structures that are, like, oppressing the working class, right? So socialism is going to be interested in protecting workers from the harm that capitalism does to them, right? And the way that they're going to describe this, right, is socialism wants to protect the people who work, i.e. those who sell their labor, from those who buy their labor, right? So socialism is going to argue that people are alienated from the goods that they produce, right? So before the Industrial Revolution, if you wanted, a jar, right? Like, you would just go to the dude who made jars and you would buy a jar from him and he set the price for the jar, right? Like, he got the profits from the jar that he sold. He got the profits from his labor. But now, because of the Industrial Revolution, right, everybody just goes to a factory and they work for usually 12 to 14 hours a day for a set wage, right? They no longer have control over the tools that they use. They no longer own the tools that they use to make stuff. They no longer own the things that they make, right? And socialism sees this as a problem, right? They see this as an alienation of labor. And so what socialism is going to argue is that workers cannot be free until they have removed this alienation, right? So until workers can control the means of production, until workers can control and own their own labor, they're not really free, right? And so socialists are going to spend a lot of time fighting about, like, how do you get this freedom? Does this mean that you need, like, a violent revolution? Does this mean you need to vote? Like, what does this look like? And socialists can't really agree on how to fix it, right? But they can't agree that the current system is bad, right? So socialism is going to argue for more radical change and change more quickly, right? So not every socialist is going to be out here being like, revolution, but they are going to be like, we need major changes in this society and we need them now, right? Now, not all socialists are going to argue that all private property is bad, but they are going to argue that the current system, right, the way that it exists, in which you have a lot of sort of like landless peasants, right, and a lot of people who are working in these factories, the current system is bad, right? Socialists are like, we don't know how to, we have different ideas about how to fix it, but we think that the current system is bad, right? So how, like, what are socialists going to focus on? What does this look like in practice? Right? And these are going to be kind of the 4 principles that socialists are going to argue that are kind of like the bedrock of society and the bedrock of their political philosophy, right? So they're going to argue that every man, right? Because again, socialists are going to be really interested in men, right? So if you go back, like, you'll notice, like, there's a few ladies in the bottom here, but it's mainly men, right? They're going to be argue for equality and this idea that there needs to be a more radical kind of equality in society, right? Socialists are going to argue for the importance of democracy, right? And this idea that every man should get to vote, right? They're not really interested in ladies voting, although a few socialists are, but they are interested in this idea that it is only through democracy that workers can achieve equality and that workers can achieve freedom, right? So number 3 on this list is going to be individual freedom. Right? So again, socialism is going to kind of wrestle with this question about, like, you live in a society, but you are an individual. Which is the most important? How does this all work? Right? And essentially what socialism is going to say is that freedom means you have the right to self-determination. Freedom means that you get the right to make meaningful choices about your life, right? That you have enough economic freedom and enough political freedom to really set your own life the way that you want to live it, right? And they say that under this current capitalist system, whereby like 80% of your wages are taken up by rent and you can barely make ends meet, right? That you're not really free in that system, right? You don't really have any choices, right? But socialism is also going to say that you exist in a community. So your individual freedom and your self-determination is important, but you can't forget that you exist as part of this larger community. Your freedom cannot come at the expense of the community, right? No one is free until we're all free. That is sort of the most basic principle for most socialists, right? Okay. So you got your 4 principles, blah, blah, blah. Now, socialists are going to spend a lot of time arguing about how to bring all of this together, and some socialists are going to argue that, in fact, these are not the right principles to have, and some socialists are going to be like, we just need a violent revolution, and that will fix all of our problems, right? And that's going to bring us to our next ism, communism, right? Now, you're all going to say it with me in your houses or wherever you're listening to this, right? All communists are socialists, but not all socialists are communists, right? So communism is it's a part of socialism, kind of under the umbrella of socialism, but not all socialists are going to believe or agree with communist tenets. But communism broadly exists under socialism because it is going to be talking about these ideas about worker equality and freedom and all of that stuff, right? So all communists are socialist, but not all socialists are communist. Okay. So in the 19th century, the guy who's going to sort of do the most to create the basic tenets of communism is Karl Marx, right? Karl Marx is going to argue that all of history is a class struggle, right? That the way that we understand history is not through religion, it's not through culture, it's not through wars, right? The way to understand history is through class tension and class warfare, essentially, right? He's going to argue that there are three sort of periods of history, right? And in each of these three periods of history, somebody different has been in charge, right? So in the first period of history, the earlier periods of history, the upper class was in charge. So this is going to be when the kings have all of the power, when the dukes have all of the power, right? And he's going to say that the current, sort of the 19th century period is when the middle class is in charge, right? He's going to be like, the middle class has more political power now, right? They have wrestled that away from the upper class, and they have taken it for themselves. And Marx says that there's going to be a third period of history, right? And then after that, like, who knows? There's just three periods for him, right? The third period of history is going to be when the working class does the same thing to the middle class that the middle class did to the upper class. So the middle class forcibly took power away from the upper class. Now it's time for the working class to wrest power away from the middle class and take it for themselves, right? And he lays out in the Communist Manifesto, right, essentially what this should look like, right? And his understanding of how this is going to happen is, of course, through violent revolution, right? And he is going to lay out what he sees of as sort of the basic tenets of communist society, which is essentially everyone shares and shares alike. Everybody participates according to their own skills, right? Communism is going to look at this sort of tension between the individual and society and say, the individual doesn't really matter, right? The only thing that really matters is society, right? So we're not interested in who you are as a person. We are interested in your class, right? So I don't care if you're Protestant. I don't care if you're Catholic. I don't care any of that stuff. All I care about, I being Karl Marx in this situation, I guess, right? All I care about is, like, are you part of the working class? Are you a friend of the working class, right? So Marx is going to say that there's not really any room for individualism within a communist society. And he's going to say that all private ownership is bad. Right? All of this private landowning business, it's all bad, right? So he spends his time kind of writing and thinking about this stuff, right? He is originally from Germany. He gets kicked out of Germany, kind of wanders around Europe for a little bit, right? And then in 1848 in Europe, there's a series of revolutions. Basically, every country in Europe has a revolution, except for Great Britain, right? And when that's happening, he's like, it's happening. We're doing it, right? And so he writes the Communist Manifesto very quickly to try to sort of help people figure out, like, what the revolution should look like and what they should want from the revolution, right? So he ends the Communist Manifesto, right? The proletarians, i.e. the working class, have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite, right? So he sends this, like, battle cry for communism out into the world, and it doesn't work, right? There are no communist countries in the 19th century. The Soviet Union's going to try in the 20th century to not great ends, which we will talk about later in the semester, right? Marx is one of those people who is very important kind of intellectually, and everybody reads him, everybody talks about him, but you don't actually see it happening a lot in society, right? Okay, next up, everybody's favorite political ideology of the 19th century, anarchism, right? Anarchism is going to be the brainchild of Mikhail Bakunin, a Russian, of course, right? And basically, like, Bakunin kind of emerges out of socialism as well, but he's going to argue that, like, there are too many rules, right? Bakunin is going to argue that a revolution needs to happen, right? And he and Marx are going to hate each other. They spend all of their time just, like, fighting each other, right? And Bakunin is going to basically say you cannot trust in any community, right? You can't trust, well, you can trust in a community, but you cannot trust in any hierarchy, right? So Bakunin's main thesis is that all governments, all hierarchies, like, so anything that has like a power structure, it will eventually take away your freedom, right? Anything that exists as part of the power structure needs to be destroyed because it will take away your freedom, right? Bakunin is going to argue that the only laws that you should submit yourself to are the laws of nature, right? So sort of the laws that the universe has agreed, right? So like, I was going to say murder, but Bakunin is kind of okay with some murder sometime, but like, you shouldn't steal from your neighbor, right? Bakunin is like, okay, fine, I will agree. You should not steal from your neighbor, right? But the idea that the government should pass a law about that, he's like, no, because they're just going to take away your freedom, and we don't like that, right? Now, Bakunin has an ugly strand of anti-Semitism woven through all of this, right? His understanding is that governments and hierarchies are controlled by Jews, and the Jews are kind of the ultimate, like, we want to take away your freedom, which is not cool. It also kind of explains like why he and Marx hate each other, since Marx grew up in a Jewish family that then converted to Christianity, right? Now, under Bakunin, not surprisingly, like Bakunin is sort of the father figure of anarchism, but it's a deeply fractured movement, right? So when you spend all of your time being like, everything's taking away your power, oh no, right? You spend a lot of time fighting with each other about who's taking away power and what like structures should look like. Should there even be any structures, right? So there's essentially kind of two strands of anarchism, right? We'll talk about cooperation first because it's pretty simple. Cooperation anarchism basically says, we all live in this community, we need to work together, but we don't need any outside forces telling us what to do, right? So we all live on a farm together, we grow the food that we need, we help each other out, but we don't listen to any outside authorities, right? The more popular strand of anarchism in the 19th century is the violent strand, right? And the violent strand of anarchism basically says, look, all these organizations, all of these governments, all of these Jews, unfortunately, are all trying to, right, and of course, none of it's true, like, it's all anti-Semitic nonsense, but that's where we're at in the 19th century, right? The violent strand of anarchism is going to say, the only way to protect your freedom, the only way to get your freedom back is by violence, right? So they're going to call that the propaganda of the deed, right? The political philosophers spend too much time like talking to each other, and we don't want to talk to each other, right? Violent anarchists are going to say what we need is to kill people, and through killing people, we can gain our freedom back, right? So let's talk about some of those assassinations, right? So of course, the first guy that they kill is the Tsar of Russia, Alexander II, in 1881. They try to blow up his carriage. It doesn't work. He then gets out of the carriage, which is very dumb. And then they blow him up and he dies, right? Now, this does not solve the problem for anarchists, but it is a way in which they attempt to sort of regain power for themselves, right? They assassinate the Empress of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Elisabetta, known as Sisi. She's considered one of the most beautiful women in Europe because of her hair, which you can see in the photo, the portrait on the left. She is stabbed to death with a hat pin in Geneva in 1898, right? Which again, it doesn't make anybody more free, but it makes them feel better, right? That they're somehow attempting to regain their freedom, right? And of course, the most infamous of the anarchist assassinations is the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in 1914. We will talk about this assassination more later. All you need to know right now is that it leads to World War I. And so that even the propaganda of the deed anarchists are like, ooh, we should tone it down, right? This is sort of the end of a major wave of anarchist assassinations. Right, but you can see it starts in the 1880s. This is in 1914 when Franz Ferdinand dies. So this is a long time. And anarchists are going to assassinate 300 political figures during this time. Like, this is a powerful, if not super successful movement in the end, right? Now, I've got one last ism to talk about, which is nationalism, right? In the 19th century, modern nationalism emerges. Lots of nations are trying to figure out what makes them a nation. How are they different from their neighbors? What does that look like, right? So today we're going to talk about two examples. The first is the Germans, right? the Germans don't become the Germans don't become a nation until 1872, so it's very late compared to other countries, right? So Germany has technically been a nation for like 100 years less than the United States has been the United States, right? Like there's a whole bunch of Germans kind of floating around wanting to be a nation, but they can't figure out how to do it, right? So in the 19th century, German nationalists are going to spend a lot of time trying to figure out, like, what makes a German? Who gets to be part of this magical German country that's going to exist one day, right? And what they're interested in is what they call the Volksgeist, right? And Volksgeist is just a German word that means sort of like the spirit of the people, right? Volk is people and Geist is spirit, so it's just like people spirit, right? So German nationalists are going to argue that the thing that makes a German is internal, right? Something about the way that he exists in the world makes him a German, right? So German nationalism is going to be very culturally based. It's going to be about what music does he listen to? What does he read? Does he speak German? Is he Protestant or is he Catholic, right? There's a big divide about whether you can be like Catholic and German, and that's a whole separate problem, right? But German nationalism is always going to be about like this eternal spirit inside you that you're just kind of born with. If you're a German man, right, you can never make a German man not German, right? Like he is born a German, right? Now, that's going to be the opposite of what the French are going to say, right? And this is not surprising because the French are going to take some German territory and argue that it's actually France in the 19th century, right? So French nationalism is going to say the way that you figure out who's in a country is who wants to be in a country, right? So there's like a French nationalist named Ernest Renan, and Renan is going to argue that if a group of men have come together and they have this shared history, particularly a shared history of suffering, they're real into suffering in France, they are a nation. That a nation is a group of men who have come together to decide and to voluntarily join this nation, right? So it's not surprising that the French are like, well, we took some land where there's some German-speaking people, and we decided that they could be French because they could decide to be French, right? And the Germans are like, no, 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 you may have taken this land. You may have made this German place part of France, the country, but a German will always be a German. He is born a German. You cannot un-Germanify him, if that's a word, right? So hopefully that makes sense to everybody, right? The French are like, it's a choice. It's a choice about a shared history of suffering. It's a choice about who we want to be the nation. And the German experience is going to say, no, no, no. You're born that way, right? Like your spirit, your soul itself is German, right? And so Europeans are going to spend a lot of time in the 19th century fighting wars about this and trying to decide who belongs where, right? And undergirding all of this is going to be this idea that if you are German or if you are French or Dutch or British or whatever, that you are Christian, right? So there's a whole bunch, well, there are some Jews living in Germany, there are some Jews living in France, and the idea is that those Jewish people don't really belong to the nation, right? The idea for German nationalists is that a Jew can never have a German soul, right? And the idea for French nationalism is that a Jewish person can never choose Frenchness in the way that a Catholic man could, right? And you're going to see some problems, some legacies of this anti-Semitic nationalism emerge in the 20th century when we talk about World War II, right? But it's important to note that it gets cemented in the 19th century, right? It's not just the Nazis that are going to do anti-Semitic things. Everybody who's creating this kind of modern nationalism, everybody in Europe, everybody in the United States, they are going to do so with this underpinning of anti-Semitism at the sort of the heart of everything, right? Kind of rotting it out from the inside. Okay, so I think, yeah, we are done. I'm sorry this video has been so long. Please, again, let me know if you have any questions, and I hope you have a great day, night, morning, whatever.